In 1921, a curator here in Bristol, England, opened a parcel from his friend Alfred Hutchins. Inside there were 2 human skulls, a small collection of stone artifacts, and inside one of the skulls there was a handful of shell beads and a little note on a slip of paper explaining what these were. The skulls had come from California. Hutchins had lived there for about 20 years from 1888, and evidently he dug them up himself. We know he was an amateur collector of curiosities and what some people have called a relic hunter.
So the term provenience actually means the 3-point position of where certain objects and artifacts are found. So when you're an archaeologist, you go out and you dig and you actually take the depth, the length, and the width of where in the ground things were found. Provenance is trying to trace, once the artifacts are out of the ground, where do they go from there?
The history of the Channel Islands off the coast of California is we have 8 islands. There's the 4 northern Channel Islands, which were occupied by the Chumash tribe, and then the 4 southern Channel Islands. One of the islands that is furthest out is San Nicolas Island. And if you go back and consider the history of these places that were occupied by our ancestors, those are like the central part culturally. They're some of the oldest areas, living areas of the tribes throughout Southern California.
In 1864, my grandfather Alfred and his brother George went off to be Victorian gentlemen. Men of leisure go out adventuring. By about 1887, 8, they had ended up in California, Pasadena and Catalina Island. And my grandfather certainly stayed there for some while, as his eldest son was born on the island and named after the town, Avalon.
The museum was left with very thin information about this donation, and that was actually still the case 90 years later when Sue Giles and I began to research the skulls in particular just a bit further to see what we could find out.
So in terms of what we know about this collection, we've looked at what's written in the register and what was put on the catalogue cards 50 years later in the 1970s. But the first part, if you like, of the documentation will be in the history file with any letters and the newspaper cuttings that came in with the collection. A letter from the 2nd of January 1921 says, "Dear Mr. Bolton," who was the director of the museum, "I'm forwarding you a box containing 2 skulls and a few stone implements that I promised to send on when I was visiting Bristol. I dug them up at Santa Catalina Island, 25 miles from San Pedro on the mainland, near to Los Angeles, South California. One of the skulls comes from San Nicolas Island, near there. I have quite a number of implements, but these are duplicates. I have enclosed a newspaper account of a collection from the same islands, which I thought you might be interested to read. I have a large collection of skulls, minerals, and weapons and other curiosities." Being abroad, nearly every object that comes into the museum in this particular collection, in the ethnography collection, it gets an individual register number. We have registered the 2 skulls, 2 pestles, 2 sinkers, and a hammerhead, a stone hammerhead, all given by Mr. Alfred Hutchins in 1921 with a question mark written after it. Human remains in museums are problematic. This is the sort of material that wouldn't be brought out to show general visitors because these people probably have living descendants. The skulls were excavated at some point in the early 20th century. It was done in a way that hopefully no one would ever excavate nowadays, so there's no information from that excavation. We don't know anything about the position of the presumably the whole body, what happened to the rest of the body. the rest of the bones? Where are they now? We don't know anything about the grave, how it was dug, the layout of the body, and any grave goods with it.
By happy coincidence, John Boragina, the curator at the Santa Catalina Island Museum, made a wonderful discovery of the long-lost papers and photographs of relic hunter Ralph Glidden, who had actually started his career in relic hunting and later archaeology at the same time that Alfred Hutchins was living on Catalina Island. And so through discussion of the Glidden material, we were able to illuminate at least the context in which the relic hunting took place and get more of a sense of the origins of this collection.
We had heard rumors of a large Glidden archive that existed, and we'd also heard from some local members in town that they had seen things while going through volunteers that we had here on the island. Talking with my executive director as well as Dr. Wendy Tito, we decided that that I would start actually spending at least 2 to 3 hours a week just kind of searching this stuff out, trying to see if we could put a finger on the location of some of the materials, all of the materials. And we eventually, after about 3 months, came across a huge collection related anywhere to his, as I said, his personal journals, to his letters to family members and curio shops which he had purchased from.
So Ralph Glidden was an islander, somebody who moved to Catalina Island during around 1896, and he was 16 years old, and became very attuned to explorers that were coming over and staying in the family bungalows, hotel on the island. And he decided to set off with a couple of explorers in the early 1900s in search of pearls, abalone pearls, which were at the time worth a great deal of money, but they were there to actually loot and to take artifacts for sale. He didn't really get the abalone pearls that he was looking for, but he did become very interested in this whole business of acquiring artifacts about these ancient communities and then selling them. I think he became very also romanticized with the notion of Howard Carter and his explorations in Egypt, and thinking that he could really make some money doing this job. So he was more after the sensational. He also, though, collected a bunch of human remains and a bunch of artifacts, and was able to convince Gustav Heye, who was forming the largest anthropology museum in New York at the time, to purchase the collection.
You have this very unique process during the late 1800s into the 1900s where people were practicing, it was collecting. People were collectors. They were armchair anthropologists, and salvage ethnography becomes part of this too, and people feel that they are saving the extinct races of people and collecting whatever they could. But in fact, what was happening was a lot of the archaeology was not done in a professional manner. It was lacking a lot of information, notes, provenience and provenance has been difficult, and it results in these situations where we have what we refer to today as pot hunting. As example, Ralph Glidden is a really good example of that, of a gentleman who was hired by the Heye Foundation back in the early 1900s and collected over 1,000 burials. So one of the things that becomes very problematic is just the history of archaeology, not only in California, not only locally, but also in the United States.
So here the Bristol City Museum had managed and cared for this collection for almost a century, and at last we were beginning to put together a picture of the circumstances in which the material was collected, and perhaps even to find out something about the two individuals whose remains are in the museum.
By piecing together all the information that we have got, by following up every faint lead, there could be scientific investigations to be done, looking at, say, wear patterns on the tools or the teeth even, investigating any trauma or wounds that might be visible on the bones. You can build up a whole picture, perhaps, we've got different techniques for dating objects so that you can work out whether these skulls are historic or fairly modern. So we can now apply all sorts of techniques to finding out information that should have been there in the original record but is completely lost.
So what we have here is this is our San Nicolas Island individual that actually has a label on it stating that this was dug up at San Nicolas Island. This is a male individual. Age of the individual based on dentition. It looks to be fully erupted dentition. In this particular image, the third molar, which is the back tooth, appears to be missing, but it's probably missing pre-mortem, which means it erupted, but it fell out. And I'll show you in a minute how we know that. But this cranium is quite robust. The nuchal crest, which is the portion of the back of the skull where neck muscles attach, is very pronounced. The mastoid process, which is the lump that you can feel directly behind your ear, is quite broad, even though it's not very elongated. You have a very powerful muscle that originates at that position, and these are the neck muscles that give power to the neck area. The brow ridge, or this area called glabella right here, is very pronounced, as are the brow ridges, which go to either side of your eyes. And the orbital margins, which you can't actually feel because it would involve shoving your finger up into your eye socket, but they do appear quite broad, and that is a male characteristic. The frontal bone is another region, upper portion of the frontal, that we can use to identify sex, but that portion happens to appear somewhat female, and that's not unusual that you're going to have a mix of female and male characteristics. In this case, mostly male characteristics. Regarding age, I had mentioned before, it looks as if the third molar had been erupted. Once that third molar is erupted, that's an indication the person has reached roughly the age of 18, because modern humans, at the age of 18, that's the age that molar erupts. The cranium is actually composed of many different bones, and when those bones knit together or fuse, that's an indication to us that the individual has reached adulthood. And all of the cranial sutures on this individual appear to be completely fused. But without more specific information on the cultural practices of the region, we wouldn't really have any other information to help us identify more specific age. So something like this, we might suggest 20 years or so of age and leave it at that. All right, so one of the other issues in this situation is looking at potential ancestry for the individual. Now, this was excavated, it was literally, it says in the label, dug up on San Nicolas Island in the Channel Islands, but that would normally indicate to us that we're talking about a Native American occupation on San Nicolas Island potentially, predates 8,000-9,000 years, all the way up to modern contact periods when all natives on the population were removed by European populations. However, we do know that it wasn't only native islanders who may have lived on the island at one time and therefore would have been buried on the island. We also might have had European descendant populations who were living there, could have been buried. Aleut populations, maybe even Chinese. And so it is important for us to be relatively sure that this is potentially a native California Channel Island individual, descendant individual. And one of the ways that we can do that is by looking at complexity of sutures. Sutures are the places where on the cranium that the different bones come together. Also shape of other kinds of sutures. This is the palatine suture. And in this case, it's the opposite of what we saw for the sagittal suture. The sagittal suture was very complex. In this case, it's a very straight, fairly simple suture. Support for native ancestry. This doesn't illustrate so well, but the sutures right here on the cheekbone, or it's the zygomatico-maxillary suture, is angled outwards from underneath portion, the inferior portion of the eye,
and it angles almost directly outwards to the cheekbone. The second individual we're looking at here is from Santa Catalina Island, according to documents. And this is a female that we can tell immediately upon looking at the anterior view, which is the frontal of the face. She has very gracile features, which is really lightly built features compared to the male individual we just looked at. Her region here, called glabella, is not very pronounced. Her brow ridges, this portion, are essentially non-existent. And the margins of the orbit here are sharp. One of the features we can use to identify age, if we have cultural background, is attrition on the dentition. And there's a great deal of attrition on this dentition. You can see the enamel is completely worn away on these back teeth. The yellow portion that is visible is the dentin, which is the inside of the teeth. And so her root would, her nerve may even potentially have been exposed in life. But again, that information tells us that she potentially had an abrasive diet. They used her teeth for some kind of activity other than chewing her food. But without cultural affiliation, nothing else particularly useful from that. When considering ancestry on this individual, the first thing we're going to note, at least since we're already on this image here, is that although she only has her left lateral, which is the side incisor, and it's quite worn, so there's a lot of attrition. There is a little portion of enamel that protrudes into where you would have the shoveling, the shovel-shaping incisors that I had mentioned before. And so this is clearly a shovel-shaped incisor. The palatine suture is a little more complex than you necessarily would classify as a native population, but so many of these ancestral features are extremely variable, and different individuals have different expressions of these features.
In this particular case with the Bristol Museum collection, what we do know is that we have two ancestral skulls, one that appears to be a female from Catalina Island, and the other who appears to be a male from San Nicolas Island. And this is based on the information that is present that the family had when they were given to the Bristol Museum.
And so Cindy and I, along with Dr. Wendy Teeter and Karima Kennedy Richardson, has created the Pimu Catalina Archaeology Project. And it really started as a way of, one, trying to find all the information about the collections that have come from Catalina, but then to also gather as much information that we can using non-destructive methods in order to tell the story of the ancestors. A lot of what gets lost many times is that so many scholars just see the ancestral remains and the objects as just that, objects, not filled with life as we see them as community members. Within our own communities, we know that the people out on Catalina were special, they were powerful. We have these stories within our communities, and we have these stories from other tribes as well. And so with the Pimu project, we are attempting, again, to gather this information and really understand and do more research on these collections that have been previously done.
In the United States, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act of 1990 is the federal legislation that provides a mechanism for us as Native American people to repatriate not only our ancestral remains, but also funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. It was originally written for federally recognized tribes, and there's many tribes that don't have that status. But because of the collaborative nature of the communities and this growing sense of urgency of resolving these issues, I think that at this point it's really providing a good model that can be used internationally. You know, this is just that time.
We see ourselves not just as community of people that are currently alive today, but we're connected to the land, we're connected to the water, we're connected to everything around us, including to our ancestors that came before us, as well as we will be connected to those that come after us. And so many communities in our community as well have really fought in order to make sure that our ancestors come back to us and be part of us once again.
Here we are, we're two individuals that not only have the cultural knowledge, not only are cultural scholars, but we're also academic scholars too. So we also become translators, sometimes to scientists, sometimes being able to understand both languages and the legal mechanisms. It just provides for us to have more success in these situations. But in our heart, just like in this room that we're sitting in here, that is filled with our ancestors, ultimately it's our obligation to return the dignity and the respect and their integrity back to them. They've been pulled out of the ground, and it's heartfelt work. It's heartfelt work, but it's also mindful work too. That we are professionals too, and we work with the utmost of professionalism.
So as I stated before, the Pimu Catalina Island Archaeology Project was started by 3 co-directors, as well as in conversation with Cindy. We also run an archaeological field school during the summers through California State University Northridge, and every summer we take about 20 students to help us understand the archaeological sites that are out on Catalina Island. So just exactly as I had discussed before, there hasn't been a good amount of information collected from those sites. You have objects, but what are those sites? What do they entail? What are the characteristics of those particular sites? So we're going out there collecting information about the landscape, the vegetation, the types of artifacts we're finding, so that we can use that information in order to understand the collections that have gone to those particular sites. And so not only are the students learning the traditional archaeological method in theory, excavation, lab work, etc., but they're also helping us go through the museum collections of the Catalina Island Museum in order to better understand how those objects relate back to the sites that are currently still on the landscape.
I'm excited about collections. I'm excited about honoring the ancestors and bringing pride to our communities, but also making a contribution to the future.
And there's really been a huge movement within the archaeological community, not only in North America, but worldwide. There's a number of indigenous scholars, community members, as well as archaeologists that participate in the World Archaeological Congress, which was really started in the late 80s, early 90s, that sought to bring Native people back to the conversation about their ancestors and to actually be active participants and collaborators in the research that's being conducted within their traditional homelands and with the items that are from their ancestors. And so this idea of indigenous archaeology, an archaeology that is practiced for, by, and with indigenous communities becomes really important. And a lot of the work that we do is just that, bringing not just indigenous communities, but bringing everybody, and for us, particularly here in Los Angeles, bringing the local people who are living on this land now. They're caretakers as much as we are, to help us understand and give honor to those ancestors.